This episode is brought to you by Marvin Planning Consultants. Marvin Planning Consultants, established in 2009, is committed to their clients and professional organizations. Their team of planners has served on chapter, division, and national committees, including as the Nebraska chapter president. In addition, they are committed to supporting their chapter in various APA divisions. You're listening to the Booked on Planning podcast, a project of the Nebraska chapter of the American Planning Association. In each episode, we dive into how cities function by talking with authors on housing, transportation, and everything in between. Join us as we get booked on planning. Welcome back, bookworms. I'm Stephanie Rouse.
And I'm Jennifer Hyatt.
And we are the hosts of the Booked on Planning podcast. In today's episode, we talk with author Nancy Castaldo on her book, Squirrel, How a Backyard Forager Shapes Our World. And with it being summer, we wanted to jump into a fun little book. We came across this. It was an Island Press book all about history of squirrels, how they entered our cities, shaped our cities, what we need to be considering. And it was a really great conversation.
Yeah, I really enjoyed it. I love my little squirrels in my backyard. And so when this book popped up, I thought that would be, like you said, a fun little summer read. And I think you can read through it pretty quick, too. It was a pretty simple read.
Yeah, I'd agree. It shaped my perspective a little bit. There's always the love squirrels, hate squirrels, and then some that fall in between. And I've always been an in-between. I have a bit more appreciation for them. I still despise the fact that they steal all my apples off my tree and dig in my garden and create chaos. But they are a pretty important part of our ecosystems and our cities and shaping how we develop. So I'll give them a little bit of a break.
Yeah, that's fair. I will maybe not curse them as much every time I pull a little tree out of my yard either. But I equally, after reading this book, won't really call anybody a squirrel brain anymore.
True. You got to stay till the end of the episode to figure out what that comment means.
Exactly. So let's get into that conversation with author Nancy Castaldo on her book, Squirrel, How a Backyard Forager Shapes Our World.
Nancy, thank you for joining us on Booked on Planning to talk about your book, Squirrel, How a Backyard Forager Shapes Our World. Among our listeners, we likely have those that love squirrels, hate them, or fall somewhere in between like myself. To start, how did we end up with squirrels in our cities?
One of the fascinating stories in the book is that squirrels didn't simply adapt to our cities on their own. Obviously, squirrels were all on the land. They were all inhabiting our forests before cities were built. However, in the 19th century, individuals, city planners, and park designers intentionally introduced squirrels into our urban parks. The introductions began in Philadelphia, and the squirrels were quite resilient when they got their little squirrel nest boxes and set up home in Franklin Park in Philadelphia in the 1800s. They were viewed as a way to bring nature into rapidly industrializing cities. They were meant to encourage people to connect with wildlife. Many of those folks had come from countryside homes and had moved into these industrialized and often challenging cleanliness and whatnot that they brought. So the squirrels were meant to give them a little sense of their homes that they were lacking and also bring that nature back into the cities. Of course, they became quite established. And after Philadelphia, they were then introduced to Central Park and then Boston Common and then Hartford. And then they just went across the country into many different parks.
Unlike Stephanie, I don't fall somewhere in the middle. I adore squirrels and I love them in my backyard. But the fact is that humans really do have a complicated relationship with squirrels. So what caused that situation?
I think it's because squirrels are close enough for us to interact with regularly for most of us. If we live in an urban setting or a country setting, squirrels really inhabit every place that there's close to 300 species. So there's a squirrel around every corner in many places. But although they are regularly seen, they're also wild enough to remain unpredictable. So we also admire a lot of things about them. We admire their athleticism and their intelligence and their persistence. But we can also be frustrated with them as they raid our gardens, our bird feeders, and even sometimes our attics. They also remind us that nature doesn't always behave according to our expectations. So that tension with squirrels has created a complicated relationship with them.
In your book, I can't remember the exact quote, but basically you say they're a wild animal that we're upset with that's acting wild, which,
Exactly. They do their thing. How can we get upset when they come to our bird feeders when we put out a buffet for them?
yeah, exactly. And squirrel around every corner. Squirrels are a species that we all see in our daily lives. I don't think I go a day without seeing a squirrel, but we don't have a lot of good data or studies on them. And as you mentioned, you can't really begin to manage a species or make decisions on how to protect them when you don't have that kind of data. So why is it lacking?
When I was doing research for squirrel, I actually decided to go down that route and talk about how mysterious they can be, even though they seem so ubiquitous. So I actually have a chapter in the book titled Mammals of Mystery. And it's hard to believe that they could be mysterious, that we could not know anything about them. But because they're so common in so many areas, we also don't study them as frequently. Many people assume that squirrels are doing fine because they see them so commonly in their neighborhoods and their parks. But there are close to 300 species of squirrels. So the species that we see commonly aren't the only squirrels around the world. And most of them around the world are also poorly studied. So that has to do directly to a few things. One is research funding. Often research funding is distributed more towards species that are larger or more iconic or charismatic or endangered. Also, many species of squirrels are nocturnal. So, nocturnal species are often more challenging to study. In addition, many of them inhabit, I'm talking globally now, very remote locations. So those also you're talking about in some cases they're nocturnal and they're in a remote location. So there's been significant gaps in our understanding of many squirrel populations and their conservation needs.
And as we've touched on, humans and squirrels have been interacting for a very long time. And also for a long time, humans actually ate squirrels. It was just a part of our normal, I guess, maybe like frontier diet, to put it one way. Obviously, we have trended away from this. So, why do you think that is when we still continue to eat plenty of other game animals? Why aren't squirrels just considered a game animal still?
In many places, they still are considered a game species. And historically, as you mentioned, squirrels were a very important food source. They even appeared in the White House cookbook in 1887 and in the Joy of Cooking cookbook into the 90s. That's pretty recent to have them out there. As societies became more urbanized and food became more readily available through commercial agriculture, many people lost that connection between hunting squirrels for food. At the same time, squirrels became increasingly part of the wildlife we watched in parks and backyards. Cultural perceptions shifted. For many people, squirrels became removed from being a food source to familiar wildlife that we enjoyed outside. But that said, there are many households, many states that still eat squirrel regularly. States, southern states specifically, Arkansas, for example, holds an annual statewide big squirrel contest hunt, and it's followed by a statewide world champion cook-off. So they still are out there on dinner plates around. And in some areas, in some urban areas, not so much, but in other areas, yeah. When I was a kid growing up in the Northeast, in a small town in upstate New York, there were squirrels. Mind you, I thought it was strange, hanging from a nearby grocery store's porch.
Kind of calls me on my Midwestern bias because I had a college boyfriend who did in fact hunt squirrels, but we all thought he was a little strange for that. I should have rephrased that to people in Nebraska.
Let's look at Jennifer Lawrence, a very well-known actress who talked about her squirrel skinning skills in an interview. Yeah, it's not my thing. It is out and about.
I love too, you point out, I think it was back in 2006, but talking about introducing new species that then overtake the species that were there before. And in London, they started putting squirrel on the menu because the gray squirrels were out competing their native red squirrels. And so it was interesting to read the different feelings that people had about actually seeing squirrels in restaurants versus here in the US, where certain regions might just culturally eat squirrels, but it's not something that you're really going to find on a menu when you go out to eat.
I found that extremely interesting. Of course, in Great Britain, they're working very hard in many different ways to control our North American gray squirrel invasion. The squirrels were brought there and they were so resilient and they took off and they really pushed out the native Eurasian red squirrels, the ones that we know and love from Beatrix Potter stories, the little squirrel nutkin with the little tufts on the top of their heads, their little ear tufts. So they've really been trying in every way, shape, or form. And that terminology it's a difficult word to pronounce. I always get it wrong. Invasivorism. That's basically eating these invasive species. And we're doing it in North America too, in many ways. The other interesting thing is that the squirrels have also become a problem in northern Italy, and they have yet to add them on the menu there. But it's a different cultural view. They, at this point, haven't reached that same heightened sense of having to do that. But they also really are, in many cases, there's folks really enjoying seeing gray squirrels because they're red squirrels, which are the same little Eurasian reds, are very shy and they're not often seen. So seeing these friendly, big little squirrels around are welcome for them. So when I traveled to Torino in Italy, it didn't take me 10 minutes to have a gray squirrel come up to me. They are fed all the time. They're out there and they have a lot of other ways they're dealing with them at this point than adding them to the menu.
So you brought up the term invasivorism. What is it and how does it impact the way we view squirrels?
So basically, it's the idea of eating invasive species as one way of helping manage their populations. I included it because it raises fascinating questions about how we respond to ecological challenges. It's not a simple solution, as I mentioned, but it encourages us to think critically about the consequences of a species and about how we introduce them into an environment. Our role in shaping ecosystems is extremely important. And it reminds us that conservation often involves difficult and sometimes uncomfortable choices as well. We see that term being used very often in fish species, marine life species at this point in the United States, but it's for many different species.
You mentioned about the gray squirrel already. I was very surprised at its kind of outsized impact on both on other squirrels and the natural environments in which they are starting to creep into. So can you talk a little bit about that?
The gray squirrel, our North American gray squirrel, is a wonderful example of how context matters in ecology. In its North American native range, which we're talking about, it plays an important role in many different settings, many different ecosystems and forests. It is a very important seed disperser and a forest gardener. The nuts it caches and doesn't eat for one reason or another. And I'm not saying they're forgotten, I'm saying they're not eaten. Sometimes those nuts are in a spot that a squirrel knows about, but perhaps that squirrel doesn't live through the winter to enjoy those nuts, or they go bad or something. So they're not all, as we commonly tend to think, forgotten about. But those nuts that are left behind for one reason or another become the next generation of trees. But when gray squirrels are introduced outside of that native range, then they're outcompeting native squirrel species and other species become in decline. So the same animal can be both beneficial and problematic depending on where it lives.
Yeah, I will say that nut caching behavior is what is my love-hate relationship, finding all of their little trees growing out of my garden beds all throughout the spring and early summer and having to pull out all of their forgotten or not forgotten, but unused nuts.
Yes, and used. Yep, that happens. Yep. But if we didn't have them, think about what would happen if we didn't have them. Squirrels fulfill so many roles in the environment. I always say to kids, I talk about different species being a part of a house of cards. When you start pulling out cards in a house of cards, the whole thing falls down. And squirrels are that in many different ecosystems. They are a keystone species that should not be pulled out of that, whether they are providing, being a seed disperser or a forest gardener, or becoming important prey for another animal. They are so important to so many ecological food webs that we have.
A big part of our audience are planners, and a lot of us are making decisions every day that are going to impact wildlife like squirrels without probably realizing it. What would you want them to be aware of or keep in mind as they're implementing plans or projects to help protect squirrels?
I love addressing this because I think that there's so much importance on planners these days because more and more cities are growing. More and more people are going to be living in cities in the future. We also have to think that wildlife is important as well. Wildlife needs more than just isolated patches of habitat, which is sometimes what happens. Green corridors are so important. Street trees are important. Parks and connected natural spaces allow animals, squirrels, and other animals to find food and maintain healthy populations. Those planning decisions affect not only the squirrels, but the entire ecological community. When we design landscapes and cities with wildlife in mind, both people and nature benefit in the long run. So, connectivity is a big issue for me. What are we doing to connect?
We'll be right back.
What makes Next City different from other news outlets is the fact that we're solutions focused, locally based, evidence based solutions.
Because our whole thing is spreading solutions from one city to the next city.
Over 45,000 people subscribe to Next City's newsletters. Readers come from city planning, from working in economic justice and community development. They might be working in transportation.
Some of our favorite feedback to receive is when folks tell us that they've ended up with ideas or tools that they can use in their own line of work in a completely different city.
A show about changemakers and their stories. Subscribe on Apple, Spotify, Good Pods, or anywhere you listen to your podcasts.
So back to those not forgotten nuts. One common misconception about squirrels is that they are a little chaotic and they seem very disorganized and they can't make up their mind when they cross the road. But you actually make the argument in the book that this is not the case. So why is this misconception wrong and why do we have it?
Like we talked about earlier, squirrels are being squirrels, right? And all of those, what looks like chaos to us, is actually a sophisticated survival strategy on their part. The research has shown that squirrels actually have a remarkable spatial memory and employ complex food caching behaviors. So actually, like being squirrel brained, when you hear people talk and say, oh my God, you're so squirrel brained, it's not a bad thing. That's what we think it is. Squirrels are constantly making decisions about where to store food, how to avoid theft, and also, along with that, how to retrieve those resources months later. So they're far more intelligent and strategic than most people realize. In the book, in Squirrel, I write a little bit about how sometimes they fend off a predator or a competitor by faking them out, by thinking that they look like they're digging a hole and they're going to put a seed in it. And in actuality, they're hiding that nut underneath their armpit. And then they go away later. And we all think if it's us or another animal that they've put that nut in that spot, but they're actually just faking us all out. So they do have a larger brain size in relation to their bodies size. That's what we look at for intelligence in species. And they've got a lot of stuff going on up there in their little squirrel brains.
Yeah, I have to admit, after reading the book, I have paid attention to my backyard squirrels a little differently now. And we also have blue jays, which are just notoriously rotten, mean little birds. And I now realize my squirrels are faking my jays out all the time. Like, it's so funny to watch them now. I'm like, oh, you're being little
Yes.
sneaks.
And both of those animals are extremely important to our forests. Blue jays also spread seeds. Yeah, so they are competing sometimes for the same things. And yeah, there's quite, again, we're talking about probably the same gray squirrels. There's so many different relationships in the environment to look at.
And you wrap up your book with a question that I think is an important one. And after reading it, I think the answer is no. We do not have the luxury of allowing the ebb and flow of attention to squirrels in this increased time of habitat fragmentation, global climate change. What would you say to our audience about what we need to be doing or why this is important?
It's a really tough thing to consider, but I agree. And I wrote, I don't think we can afford to overlook a familiar species. And often one of the quotes that I have in the book is by Rosalie Edge. We can't overlook the common. We have to spend our time looking at the common while they're still common, studying them. There's already endangered species, squirrel species in the United States, which is hard to believe when we see squirrels out our window every day. But we already do have threatened species and endangered species that are happening out there. And those populations we could lose if we don't pay attention. Climate change and habitat fragmentation are affecting ecosystems at an unprecedented scale. Squirrels can help us understand those changes because they're so widespread and closely tied to their environments. Paying attention to them, helping to fund the research that we need for them is vital at this point. And also just to realize that when we're taking care of our own small environments around us, what we have control over, taking them into consideration. So in the bigger picture, planners are so important, forest managers are important, scientists are important, but we also can play a role in our own backyards.
Yeah, one of my favorite stories that you shared, and a great way to find research and whatever, is the people who were doing data collection in New York City in their central parks. Can you share with our audience that story, and then maybe we can inspire some people to do some of that data collection of their own?
Years ago, there was a squirrel census conducted in Central Park. Now, as we mentioned, the squirrels were introduced to Central Park, and at the time that they were introduced, some of them inhabited beautiful squirrel palatial houses that people set up in the Ramble in Central Park. And so they've been very prolific there and really have a well-established population. But over the years, nobody studied them. They only basically were concerned if there were harsh winters and they felt they needed food or there was other things, factors impacting the park. But there was the squirrel census that was conducted and the results were interesting and you could go online and look it up. It's fascinating. And just to find out how many are in a park, how many species are there, how many individuals are there, are things we don't know. What is the state of our squirrel populations? And in some cases, obviously, those are taking place in areas. I also wrote about a college in New England, the New England University, which has Project Squirrel. And they're doing a lot of research and collecting a lot of data. And they're hoping that one day that research, that data is used by scientists. At this point, it's available. It's out there. They've generated all this data and they're just basically doing data collection. And it's like the same thing with Central Park. It's data collection, but we have to be able to fund those scientists to be able to use that data to actually come up with planning in the future.
Correct me if I'm wrong. I think I remember you mentioned you have an app or a website where people can go.
I don't have an app or website, but there is a squirrel tracker app that Squirrel Census created. And it could be just on your phone. It's really simple to use. You basically just tap it when you see a squirrel. And if you see a deceased squirrel on the road, squirrels are the most common animals that are a roadkill in our country, all over the place. If you see a deceased squirrel, you can just scroll over and hit deceased squirrel, and a little thing comes up and says, RIP squirrel. But the great thing about it is it does generate this big map of all these squirrel sightings, but it doesn't go further than that. It doesn't tell you what the species of the squirrel is. And a lot of people don't even know that some creatures are squirrel species. For example, I live on the East Coast. We have chipmunks that are common. On my property, I'll see red squirrels, chipmunks, gray squirrels, and woodchucks or groundhogs. So prairie dogs, groundhogs, whatever you want to call them, whistle pigs, whatever you want to call them. Marmot family are also squirrels. They're also part of the squirrel family. So the squirrel family consists of tree squirrels, flying squirrels, and ground squirrels. So sometimes folks don't even know that they have as many species of squirrels residing around them as they do.
Yeah, I certainly would not have known that my little prairie dogs were a squirrel species.
Yes, they are. And there's a lot of conservation and going on about prairie dogs and what prairie dogs bring, the benefits that they bring with their burrows by aerating the soil and providing homes for many other animals. There's so many things that they do, but they also can be problematic. So there's also a movement to relocate them sometimes into other areas where they can be really beneficial, but not create the downsides, the holes or on farmland and certain things. But they're important for our prairies and our deserts.
Yeah, here in Nebraska, especially Western Nebraska, we have two really ensconced camps because the ranchers understandably do get frustrated with prairie dogs because their cattle will step in the holes, break their legs. Their horses will do the same. But I also love prairie dogs. So,
You know, every creature has a purpose, and it's just a matter of how we can coexist and finding those ways to coexist. And part of that can be the job of planners. That's the great thing, that planners can help us along the way.
yeah, exactly.
Lubbock, Texas, they have capitalized on prairie dogs and has made it a tourist attraction. So when I lived down there wasn't a whole lot to take people to, but I always took them to the prairie dog town.
There you go. Yeah, I love that. The prairie dog town. I love that. That's fun.
So, what made you choose to focus on squirrels for this book? And where do you fall in the squirrel camp?
I was drawn to squirrels. First of all, the squirrel story of them being introduced to our parks was the story that sparked my interest. And I was working on another book at that time that little factoid came up, and I thought, that's weird. And then I happened to, of course, have squirrels around my house. I was drawn to them like everyone else. They're familiar. They are usually the first animal, the first wild mammal that we are introduced to as children. So I have my little squirrel stories from feeding the chipmunks when I was a little girl. And yet I realized over the years and after working with so many other iconic species that we were forgetting the familiar. And as I dug deeper, I found connections to history and ecology and conservation and urban planning, climate change and human culture, and they just deserve their own book. So as for the camp that I'm in, I'm going to be a little cagey here, a little squirrely maybe. I would say I'm firmly in the camp of curiosity and appreciation. The more I learned about squirrels, the more fascinated I became with all squirrel species. And with that, I'll tell you that every friend and writer friend and relative of mine have now given me, I have my own squirrel collection of things, from tea towels to statues to Christmas ornaments and everything else. So while I don't need to go that route, I definitely look at my squirrels and those around that I visit. I never realized how many photographs, I'm also a photographer, I never realized how many photographs of squirrels I actually have from around the world until I started working on this book. And I thought, yeah, they are that familiar little animal that you see around that you do tend to gravitate to.
What's funny about that is I was a golfer growing up all through middle school, high school, and you spend a lot of time as a parent following your kid around a golf course. My mom's the photographer for the family, and I think each season she probably ends up with a couple dozen photos of squirrels from various different golf courses to entertain herself with.
It's true. I'm a person who loves to be out in the woods and I love to be out in nature. There's usually a squirrel that comes to visit. And yeah, there's been plenty.
In addition to your great book, what other books would you recommend our listeners check out?
I do have a few here. I'm going to start actually with the one that spurred me to write this book. And I'm going to hold it up. It's called Buildings That Breathe. And it's a book about greening the world's cities. And the beautiful tree scrapers that are on the cover here is basically what's got me really into writing this book. These towers are designed by an architect in Italy. This is in Milan, named Stefano Boere. To write this book, I went to the UN's Forum on Urban Greening in Italy. And so I was really interested in Stefano's. I wrote basically how these towers came about and then also about a lot of other greening. So I would recommend that, but also books that inspired me when I was writing that book. One is a fiction book, and it's by Italo Calvino named Invisible Cities. Italo Calvino was an author that inspired Stefano Boeri to create those towers. Italo Calvino is a famous Italian author that wrote a book called Baron in the Trees that Stefano Boeri read as a child, and it really inspired him to create these tree scrapers in Milan. He won all kinds of architectural awards. They're now all over Europe and in Asia. So reading those books from him, from his recommendation, inspired me to go a little deeper. He also wrote a book called Green Obsession with the subtitle Trees Towards Cities, Humans Towards Forests. So he was very involved in greening the cities of Europe and in Asia. He also wrote a book called Urban Ecology, Detroit and Beyond. So I thought those were interesting. And then in my own world of reading outside of him, Crossings by Ben Goldfarb is a great way to talk about planning, how road ecology is shaping the future of our planet. And then also books by Robin Wall Kimmerer, Douglas Ptolemy, and Aldo Leopold are among my favorites.
I love it. I love all the connections there between the book that you wrote and who inspired it, and then their inspiration, tying them all together.
Yeah, that's the one wonderful thing about research is that one thing takes you down a rabbit hole and you go down that one. And yeah, so basically when I was working on Buildings That Breathe and I found out this little information about this park, I was writing about city parks at that point and found out about squirrels being introduced to Philadelphia. It just really took me down that little strange little hole. The squirrel hole.
Nancy, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast today to talk about your book, Squirrel, How a Backyard Forager Shapes Our World.
Thank you so much for having me.
We hope you enjoyed this conversation with author Nancy Castaldo on her book, Squirrel, How a Backyard Forager Shapes Our World. You can get your own copy through the publisher at Island Press, which is now an imprint of Princeton University Press, by supporting your local bookstore, or of course, supporting our show through our page at bookshop.org/shop/bookdownplanning. Remember to subscribe to the show wherever you listen to podcasts, and please rate, review, and share the show. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you next time on Booked on Planning.